Welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping the African continent. Just days after the elections and a day before results were due to be announced, there has been a coup in Guinea-Bissau. Is democracy on the way out in West Africa? The Central Bank of Nigeria held rates and stopped new state loans after large unrecovered debts, pushing private-led credit. Can private banks fill the financial gap for key sectors? South Africa and the EU agreed on local mineral processing while securing supply for Europe's green tech. The European Investment Bank pledged renewable energy funding for Africa. Can South Africa industrialize fast while supplying Europe? Joining us today for further insights is Samuel Atiku. Welcome, Samuel, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Let's begin today with our story of the Guinea-Bissau coup. So across West Africa, we've been seeing kind of democratic disruptions. So we've seen that in Mali, we've seen that in Burkina Faso, we've seen that in Niger, and now we're seeing that in Guinea-Bissau. Is this reflective of a failing institution, declining public trust in democracy, or is both? Do you also think that the people who are experiencing this coup are in support of it, or they're not in support of it as well? And why are we seeing this trend? I mean, if some weeks back, we also discussed on the podcast, Nigeria had an alleged coup, which was, of course, denied by the Nigerian military. But we're seeing this wave of coups coming back to West Africa. Why is this happening, and what can be done to stop it? Are we losing democracy?
Yeah, I think it's sad that gains that we seemed to have how will I put it now? We seem to have moved in the direction towards a more participatory government across Africa, and all of a sudden we're beginning to see backtracking, especially as I'll call it new and inexperienced and often power hungry young military officers, we try to drill down, and I was having this conversation with someone. If you try to drill down, I think the root cause, because yeah, we can look at the symptoms and try to maybe talk about the symptom. The root cause continue to be that power seems to be concentrated in the hands of a few. Even within military, the way the military is designed, power seems to be concentrated in the hands of a few. And that's exactly what we see in Africa. Unfortunately, because of fear, because of lack of the willpower to democratize access, we continue to have this kind of. And what do I mean by power being concentrated in the hand of? If you look at the military itself, uh, uh, the strongman concept, the hierarchical design, the way the military is designed, that hierarchical design, which is functional one way or the other for certain things, especially for decision making, and then to cascade instruction down there, it works, but it also makes you extremely very vulnerable. When you look at countries, for instance, the US, a good example is the US. You have the National Guard under the direct control of states, except maybe the president issues I would like us to visit and then try to actually nationalize those National Guards. Now, it's difficult for you to begin to arrange coups across states. You understand my point? You have to talk to 54 different leaders for you to actually get their buy-in and then take this direction. But you have a situation whereby one man just sit on top and controls all military infrastructure, the signal, control virtually everything. And that's what one key thing. The root cause, one of the biggest and the root cause of the way architecture, the security architecture, the defense architecture of Africa had been put. And it's designed specifically because even when people are elected, they want those clear control over what is going on. I think that's the first issue we need to talk about. Um, and it's not just peculiar to, if you look close, in fact, Nigeria even had, I'll call it something that looks a little bit better, but it's even vulnerable. If not that, now in Nigeria, you now have the Brigade of Guard, one way or the other, separated from the military, and then the Brigade of Guard is actually charged with the responsibility of protecting the president. Then you have the DSS or the SSS also. Then you have the military, and everything is beef-rising. That's why you have, how will I call it now? We've not had coup in Nigeria. Even attempt when people attempt coups, it has historically failed in Nigeria. But I will still say that Nigeria is still a very vulnerable state because uh, power is still concentrated. My oga at the top, my oga, all those cultures, we need to disuse them. It's the same thing with the police. The inspector general of police just pass instructions across, and everybody just takes it line without even thinking about things. Yeah, it works. It can be functional, but it's risky. So my first take here is that the architecture of our defense system across Africa needs to be torn apart. And we need to begin to inject the semblance of participatory governance, even within it. We need to begin to delegate powers so that power is not concentrated in the hand of few. That's to say that. But that said, back to your question, whether democracy is actually taking a turn. Yeah, of course, democracy, the whole concept of democracy is giving people ability. I mean, people now, citizenry, the working poor, they have not, everybody, the rich in society, actually collectively elect their leaders. Of course, the majority takes precedence, right, and begin to actually govern the state. Now, when someone, because he has access to gun, I would like, because you have access to guns, you have military uniform and all those things, decide to hijack the state. That itself, sometimes I struggle to understand the rationale behind it. That means everything is falling apart, regardless of what you are doing. What has happened in Guinea-Bissau is very straightforward. You have two things. You have two people contend. I mean, election had happened. People are claiming victory. Again, it raised the big question. Why are we not transparent around elections? That's a big question. So I will say why coup d'etats are symptoms, that's the way I see it. They are symptoms. They are deep-rooted issues that we need to fix. And just to specify again, just to reiterate, one, we need to fix our defense infrastructure, our security infrastructure, and the architecture in which people, all those, we need to decentralize power, just to put it in. That's the first thing. Number two, the electoral system needs to be transparent. We don't need someone with gray hair to bring calculator and start computing. You don't need that. There are systems to get that done. It must be done I mean, everybody should be able to have access. You don't need all those things. We need to be very transparent around what we are doing. We need to make sure that every vote, one vote, it's actually recorded against one man, and that you don't use the force of your force and power to begin to actually manipulate the electoral system. That is number two. Then the whole contest of drugs in politics, we need to talk about it. In Guinea-Bissau, you see a lot of allegations around politicians and drug trafficking going on there. So narco money has actually even flowed into the system, which makes it even more difficult to actually make things work in that state. And then we can, again, I keep saying it. It's all about power concentration, and then this one fact. So it's a big, it's disappointing when you say I mean, to say the least, that in 2020, in 2025, we are talking about coups in Africa. Why we should be moving in the direction of development.
I mean, I do agree with you because I mean, development and sustainable development is something that the conversation is what we're supposed to be driving. So it's sad that we have to go back and discuss things like coups. I mean, you made like really interesting points, but I do agree with electoral transparency. because once elections are transparent, that means the person that emerges as the candidate is the people's choice. And when is the people's choice, I think there's no controversy as to who the people want as their leader. Let's move over to our second story for today, where we're having to see the central bank's decision, the Central Bank of Nigeria's decision to halt new state loans. And this is signaling a shift away from public sector financing. What uninterpreted consequences could this have on job creation and also for the subnational development as well? Our private banks typically, would try to avoid high risk sectors without incentives. What would it take to genuinely make this sector, especially sectors like agriculture, manufacturing that we actually need in Nigeria, um, to attract private-led funding?
Oh, so sorry. I did not know I was on mute. I was just talking. Yeah. So what I was saying is simple and straightforward. The central bank, as one way or the other, hit the intervention wall. We knew it would happen. In 2014, the CBN actually packaged what we call a bank bailout and disguised it as if it was bailing out state governments. Rather than allow bank take it, of course, we knew what happened in 2008 when we had the banking crisis. I mean, the banking crisis in Nigeria after the subprime fiasco that created a whole lot of global financial meltdown. In 2014, oil price slumped. Nigeria, unfortunately, state government were struggling to pay salaries. I think only 5 states in Nigeria could pay salaries. I remember that time very well. And then how will I call it now? They now repackage those bank loans and then call it a federal government instrument. That's one. Number two, the central bank also using its ways and means, printing money in simple terms, also did advance a lot of debts to the federal government. And then the central bank also went into going into some development and they went into some quasi-fiscal, what you call quasi-fiscal lending itself, begin to advance money to, say, Dangote refinery, for instance, begin to advance loans directly to entities, packaging it in such a way that it's very difficult for people to really say, oh, this is what is going on. We knew that the Central Bank of Nigeria has not been a transparent organization. Sorry to say this, it's one of the most opaque organizations you can deal with, the Central Bank of Nigeria. But that said, actions of the Central Monetary Authority so around you, those inflationary pressures. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing I will say here, again, building on that, is that the policy now, if you look at what has happened, was that the central bank was intervening, and then all of a sudden we have a new government that comes in now about 2 years ago, and then they said, oh, they are going to shift their policy away toward allowing the market to determine and shape things. Right, that sounds fantastic on paper, meaning that banks should make their decision and face the consequences of their decisions. And then we went on this spree of actually dropping subsidy on everything. Oil, I mean, for instance, federal government revenue went from about 5 trillion to almost 21 trillion, meaning that the federal government is now richer than it was when this government came on board. And the same thing applies to state government. So states are washed with a lot of cash. But the question now is that why are states actually not paying down with the new money that they got? Why are they not actually paying down that debt? Remember 2014 debt. The reason is because simple and straightforward. Politicians, they were not necessarily responsible for those debts. So it's not their priority. The priority of politicians is actually to show today that they are doing some work. And they want to show it by putting in physical infrastructure. You see them want to put in roads. Some of them want to put in airports that people will remember there for without, I would say, without significant planning, just to use the word loosely. Of course, some of them plan, but those plans sometimes are questionable. Now, where we are now, in fact, that the central bank, despite the promise that they are not going to regulate things, they are going to allow market to determine things, are now stepping in again and using, I'll call it the whip, to actually force bank to stop funding states. Now, there's a question and there's a catch. Can the Central Bank of Nigeria adjudicate and decide fiscal operation across states? I don't think so. I think the central bank is overstepping its bounds. And there's a reason for that. Me, I come, my background, libertarianism. I believe that government should not be putting his hand and his mouth in everything that people are doing. You don't have to encroach on people's private businesses and private properties as long as they are not harming other people. Now, the question is that why would a central bank governor decide whether Lagos State should borrow money or not? That should be the decision of the legislators and the people of Lagos. Why should the Central Bank of Nigeria be deciding whether maybe Cross River or maybe it's Kaduna borrow money or not? It's not the responsibility of the central bank. I think that's the first question we need to mention. Now, back to the core. Now, even when we look at these banks that we are talking about, so this the how will I put it now? The central bank is trying to paint it as if oh, banks needs to diversify their investment, they want to invest in the private sector. All those things are not the way it will portray. For instance, if you look closely at the numbers, right? Oil and gas, that's the extraction element of the sector itself, accounts for roughly about 20% of total loans advanced by banks in Nigeria. When you look at manufacturing, remember Dangote cement, Dangote refinery, the refining element is a manufacturing firm, not an oil and gas firm. The extraction is the oil and gas sector. If you look closely at manufacturing in Nigeria, it accounts for about 27% of loans. And if you look at it, drill down very well and look at the numbers very well, it's dominated by cement manufacturing, refining actions, activities, and then you see some breweries putting their heads in there and all those things. Yeah. But when you look at the real thing, like the thing that can create jobs for us, and how do you create jobs in this kind of in the kind of society we live in? It's with construction. China, for instance, the biggest bulk of the job in China is actually produced by construction, and then the multiplying effect of that cascade across the idea is that are we really spending enough on construction, housing estates springing up in Nigeria? No. How many Nigerians have had access to actually buy their house on a mortgage system? No. In fact, the infra to the UK or you go to the US and you look closely at their financial system, you will notice something backs it up. So, for instance, in the US, roughly about I think about 40% thereabout of assets of bank are backed with mortgage, right? And then when you bring in real estate itself, I'm talking about commercial property, then it begins to go up. When you go to the UK, you see that big substantial amount of banks assets are actually backed with are backed with actually what you call properties, housing, and all those things. That's the underlying asset backing it. But when you come to Nigeria, it's a loose cannon. Nothing backs it. It's just government goodwill that backs Nigerian financial market. If government actually start coughing, the entire banking system can collapse into itself. Or peradventure, you begin to look at the big manufacturing firm. And if you look at cement, for instance, cement is again dependent on the fact that government continues to spend on roads. You see concrete road now, everybody talks about concrete road. A lot of lobbying goes into that. Refining. So it's all government dependent. But when you look at the core issues that Nigeria really need, like building new houses, fixing our infrastructure, getting things going, you will see that very limited amount of loans go into those sectors. And just to round off, so that I don't over talk about this, Yes, the Central Bank of Nigeria, it's a regulatory body, but I think they're overstepping their bounds, trying to actually stop states from functioning the way they would love to function. That's given. But that said, also, Nigerian banks also need to look at the risk involved in the kind of asset they have. And then they need to begin to diversify. I don't think the Central Bank of Nigeria should be the one making decisions for banks. But when banks make wrong decisions, let them face the consequences of those wrong decisions. So I'll end by saying that yes, we have a problem in Nigeria. Your question is very, very pertinent itself. Let's be
Yeah.
very clear. But the real issue there is that the Central Bank of Nigeria should know overstep his back. Going to territory should not go. Definitely, the crisis that come after is always having more severe pain. I mean, people feel the pain of those decisions even more, and then the implication of that on the wider economy is always very, very material.
I mean, I do agree with you that the CBN, I mean, kind of like is stepping its bound. But I mean, if you look at it on one hand, we faced the banking crisis before, and the bank is just, looking into the future and trying to protect the banks to ensure. But like you said, banks also need to review their risks and see how they can put their portfolio somewhere else as well. And onto our final story where we're looking at South Africa. The EU wants to secure minerals in South Africa, and South Africa wants local processing. How much value is enough? Because before South Africans can stop benefiting from and just start, serving um, internal interest as opposed to the external one. I know, like, a country wants to give or take and push for the progress of their country, but offering your mineral resources, I don't know how far South Africa wants to go. I mean, what's your opinion about the South African EU mineral and trade, will I call it trade by barter, and the renewable energy financing for industrialization that EU is offering Africa?
Yeah, I think it's a, I would like call it a very interesting question. I think there's an opportunity here, whether we like it or not. But it's a race, I would say it's a race against South Africa's own interest. Let's be sincere with ourselves. If you look at the EU South African clean trade and then the investment partnership, I think what you see is critical infrastructure in the mineral batteries in technology. And then when you look at South Africa also, South Africa itself is the one saying, "Oh, we'll supply you that, we'll give it to you, but we want more value addition at home, so that we don't sell just raw material." I think that's the whole architecture of what the deal looks like. If you read the deal very well, so EU on one side, then you have the European Investment Bank on the other side, and then they are trying. I think they're putting in about 10 to 12 billion euros, right, on the in this deal to actually support South Africa's infrastructure. And then on the other side also, you have South Africa already thinking. So to the question, the first thing is that South Africa must fix its energy and logistic problem. And South rapidly degenerating. If you look at it, they have a lot of massive shortfall in terms of their energy. And so the first thing is that if the EU money that is coming in, of course, help them accelerate, how would I call it now? It helps them accelerate the level of their industrialization to a particular point. I think the real deal is that, oh, we give you the raw material, but we want to process some before we hand it over to you. But if they can use that and they know what they are doing, of course, they can use that to fix that energy deficit that they have. Tension, they begin to fix their logistics challenges. Just for context, South Africa is way big. It's a big country. The roads needs to be fixed, the rail system and all those. It's a very big country, and then the temperature in South Africa, the weather is a little bit harsh. compared to what you get in countries in West Africa. If we don't know, South Africa is a little bit complex. And so if they get this money and this money help them actually accelerate a bit of that, I think it helps in one way or the other. I think the second thing you talked about is about whether the CTIP language itself around local processing, business to government forum, whether it could actually translate into injecting some kind of local content system, the kind of local content system that Nigeria has experimented with when oil was the deal in Nigeria. I don't think everybody talking about local content again in Nigeria. I think if they can bury that into the agreement, I think it will help a lot. For instance, if you look at the deal, you have a long-term supply contract with firms, right? But the firms are actually not committing to local processing. They are not committing to skill development. They are not committing to suppliers development. Of course, it's going to impact significantly long term on South Africa's capacity. Because as long as you don't train people to be able to man those positions, to be able to do certain things, what happens thereafter is that when this deal begin to wind down, what happens? I think that's the second thing. I think the third thing is about balancing EU's needs, of course, with African politics. South Africa is positioning itself as a gateway for European capital into African renewable energy and minerals. Yeah. They want to show themselves that, oh, if you want to do deal in Africa, this is how to do it. You come through us. And then we can also we can influence other African countries to actually roll it through. Well, it sounds nice on paper, but we need to remember that it's not just Europeans, the EU, that is looking for this. You can remember that they are in competition with China. And then how China has been able to manage that exposure also is something for people I mean, the Europeans need to pay close attention to. You are not going into South Africa because you are the only one. There's China also looking around. And I'm sure by the time the US gets on its feet, I don't know whether they're on their knees now, they will also be in the system to actually extract out of Africa. So the big take here is that yes, South Africa is they're positioning themselves as a gateway to the European capital, right? Into African renewable energy, just to reiterate. But they need to be, you need a lot of work, especially the Europeans to actually sustain it, given the fact that other people are looking around. I will say if we put those three things together, um, anything that actually brings in money and that money is utilized appropriately job the people that do not have jobs, especially for the young people in South Africa, helps reduce crime, which we all know South Africa is known for crime, and then address some, I'll call it some very severe um, inequality, economic inequality. I mean, just for clarity, in Nigeria, you can go to your village and beg for land to cut grass and then you start farming. When they say, oh, people should go back to farm. In South Africa, you don't even have the farms to go back to. So most of them take to crimes. We need to understand that, right? The peculiarity of what the apartheid regime in South Africa had done to the country. So anything that creates job for those young people that are taken to the life of crime is good, one way or the other. I would say that's the positive. But on the other side, on the flip side of things, also is that South Africa also need to think long time. And in how do you think long term? You make sure that definitely there's local content built into this kind of deal. Number two, you are building skills of your people to be able to man and begin to do things, begin to manufacture things themselves. And then by effect, if they can do those two, if you can put those two things on ground, I think the overarching goal is that the funds that you get into the system is invested. It's invested in the country and then transform the life of people. But if you don't do those elements, if you don't put those elements into your development plan, we know what happens after thereafter. Then the resource cost issues now come back again. And then you begin to hear stories around people stealing money, people doing this thing, and then the country begins to deteriorate even further, and then insecurity worsens, and then God knows what happened thereafter.
Thank you very much for your response. That's all for today on the podcast. To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insights into our work, please visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you very much, Samuel, for joining us on the podcast. It's always an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Yeah, it's always a wonderful time to have conversation with you about the geopolitics and the economic issues we are facing.
I know it's always interesting and a learning curve for me as well. Thank you for tuning in to our listeners to the week ahead. Join us next Friday for more updates shaping the African continent.